Hello again. In this video, I'm going to be talking about World War II. So, you're all probably really familiar with it. I don't want to go, step by step through the war or anything. I just kind of want to talk about the importance of what happened here. So the war was huge. We know that. I might have. I don't know. I've seen graphs that show the loss of lives in wars, and it's like all the other ones. There's World War II way up there. So it was estimated between 55 and 60 million deaths. Of those, nearly half were Soviet Union people. 6 people were Jewish victims of the Holocaust, and I don't have that in front of me, but a lot of them were civilians. Okay, a lot of civilians died in this war. 6 million, Jewish victims of the Holocaust, they were all civilians. Okay, so I think while we talked about how it was not clear what caused, well, there's a lot of things that went into causing World War One. Hitler's desire to expand Germany across Europe, and create a German empire, was basically what started the war, right? And the war was between the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, Japan, and all of their allies, and the Allies, um, Britain, Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and their allies. Okay, and this truly was perhaps even more so a world war, because it was in two fronts in Europe and in Asia, but just so many people, were involved in it. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the period, between the wars. So what's happening is that Nazi leadership, Adolf Hitler and all of his friends, his cabinets, etc. They did a number of things. So they suspended the reparation payments. They started rearming. Remember, I said that the Treaty of Versailles told them that they couldn't do that. And by 1935, they were openly building a military that was way more than what they had in World War One. Okay. Um, I liked what your book said about it was a period of time when he was playing chicken with the rest of Europe. So he basically would do something and then he'd wait and see how they reacted. And France and England, especially England, were practicing what's been called appeasement. They continually back down. And the prime minister of England would come back from a meeting with Hitler and he'd say, "We have peace in our time. It's this is a good thing here." And they kept saying that, and because they were really hoping that he wouldn't push it any further. But of course, he did get to the point, beyond. He crossed that line, right? Um, in reality, if you think about the context, um, of the world in that time, they had just gotten over a war that was just horrible, right? They didn't want another war. The people didn't want another war. The governments didn't want another war. And I also think that it's important, and we'll talk about this again, when we talk about the Holocaust. The world was actually anti-Semitic a lot, which meant that Hitler ranting on and on and on about the Jews. Well, okay, right? So they really didn't want to to go to war. So first thing he does, 1938, he annexes Austria, and that's called the Anschluss, right? And that's not even technically the beginning of the war. So um, then he goes into Czechoslovakia, into the Sudetenland, which was an area in Czechoslovakia where a lot of Germans lived. And so France and England again said, okay, he's uniting the Germans in Austria, he's uniting the Germans in Czechoslovakia. Okay, we'll let him do that. And then in 1939, they just occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. Again, they don't do anything. Okay. And then later that year, later that year, he marches into Poland. And that was too much. Okay. So we'd had, again, all those little treaties, Germany and Italy form an alliance. Germany also signed a treaty, a non aggression pact with the Soviet Union. And probably neither the Soviet Union or the Nazis knew that it was really not going to work, but they were kind of putting it off, right? Neither of them had any ideas that they were going to honor that. Okay, so war started in September of 1939, and when Germany invaded Poland, France and Britain finally said, "Okay, this is not going to work. There's no point in it." So. The German army, as I said, was bigger than what they had in World War One. They were trying a kind of blitzkrieg war, or lightning war, that meant that they were going to quickly, move in, and assumed they would get very little resistance. They could, take in thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war. France declared war immediately, but it didn't actually attack. They kind of just waited, for them to come over quickly. They did. They took over France by early 1940, and they went around the Maginot Line, Maginot, yeah, I think that's how you say it, line that France had, prepared, and they were very quickly, they defeated the Scandinavian countries. Then they went into the Netherlands, Belgium, and then into France, and got quickly to Paris. And that was kind of the early moves. France is now out of the war, right? Because they've been conquered already. That leaves England. So Germany then tries to conquer England. So by bombing them, the Battle of Britain, right? Every night, or almost every night, they sent over all these planes to bomb the cities and bomb the factories and everything, and destroy the Air Force, get the Brits to surrender, or at least, get them beaten down enough that they could invade. That really didn't happen. The British had a lot of weaponry. They had factories that were churning out lots of planes and, all the other things that they need. Okay. United States stayed out of the war for as long as they could, though they did support Britain through the Land-Lease Act. And so they were supporting them with money, basically unlimited support, much like what we're doing for Ukraine now. But this was in the form of food and military supplies, probably, rather than, anyway. So, Germany formed an alliance with Japan, and that was probably in large part responsible for the U.S. joining the war in Europe, because when Japanese attacked the United States, then they convinced Hitler to declare war on the United States as well. So even though some of his people didn't want to, he was like, "Yeah, sure, we'll do that," right? So the war in Asia involved more than just, before they attacked Pearl Harbor, they had invaded China and Manchuria, and they were quite brutal there. Your book doesn't really talk much about it, but they were very brutal over there. And so, anyway, so then we get the United States kind of joining the war. But we know they didn't go into Europe until D-Day, right? So Germany controlled a lot of Europe in the East by then, right? They had actually been, even moving down into North Africa. But what's going to happen with the Soviets, right? Okay, so the non-aggression pact had been signed. I said that. But by the spring of 1941, Hitler said, yeah, okay, we can go ahead. And he wanted to wait until Britain was surrendered, but Britain just kept holding out. So then he said, well, I can get there. So he thought, I have plenty of time. I know all about Napoleon, but I have plenty of time. We can get in there. The Soviets had a bigger army than what they thought. They had a little bit more. They were not totally ready, but they were more ready, right? And also so Germany invaded in June of 1941. The Soviets had, I think at that time, about, I don't know, 5 or 6 million active soldiers, another 10 or 12 million, in reserve. And they mobilized a whole bunch more during the war, of course. Germany was initially successful, but then winter came, and the Soviets also moved back. They dismantled factories and moved them back. And then, reassembled them and started churning out, more weapons and planes and all that other stuff. But the Germans were basically largely frozen in place for the entire winter, just as Napoleon had been, right? And that helped, give the Soviets a little bit of breathing room. Okay. So, by this time, right? So anyway, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. The Americans and the British started moving in from Africa, over into Egypt and up into Italy. Italy surrendered, and I'm not. I don't want to go through the whole thing, but all of this happened before D-Day, and that was kind of what I wanted to get to. So all of this happened before D-Day. Once D-Day happened, then really, once they kind of breached that barrier there, they being the Allies, were able to kind of quickly march onto Germany, and freeing areas along the way. They set back and they let the Russians take Berlin, because they had fought so valiantly. I don't know. They had a lot of reasons for doing this. But, that's how we get to the end of the war in Europe. Okay. It's also worth talking about the home front, because the home front is really important in this war. It was important in World War I too, but it was very important in this war. So a total war. So it's a world war, global, right? But it's a total war because it involves all aspects of the society. So men are gone, women step up. They work in the factories. They worked on the front lines too. I mean, they drove ambulances. There were women pilots that ferried planes back and forth across the English Channel. There were stuff like a lot of jobs like that. Nurses, ambulance drivers, that sort of thing. But also all of the factories were all focused on producing things that were needed in the war. There was rationing, and people were like, yeah, we're saving our food for the soldiers, that sort of thing, right? The Germans they also had a total war, but they really kind of hid how things were going from their people. But what they did is they rounded up all of these people, right, and they used them as slaves. And then eventually, the first camps were actually work camps, and so these people were working on on building things for the war. Okay. Um, After the war in Europe was over, then we had to finish the war in the Pacific, right? And that was pretty much left to the United States. Um, and they had been well, actually, that's not true because the Australians and other people were fighting in that area as well. But we know that instrumental in ending the civil or the war in the Pacific was the dropping of the atomic bombs, and the role of the Manhattan Project and Los Alamos and all of that stuff. You're probably very familiar with that, right? Um, but it was we told the Japanese, the decisions were that it was going to be very costly in terms of lives, especially American lives, right? But also German lives. I mean, Japanese lives, because they were they looked at the past battles and they knew that invading the mainland was going to be a lot of deaths anyway. And so they decided, Truman decided, because by this time Roosevelt had died, so Truman decided to use the bombs that were initially being developed to use on Germany, but the war ended, right? So they told Japan they were going to drop this bomb if Japan didn't surrender. They didn't. They dropped the bomb. They told them they were going to drop another one if they didn't surrender. They didn't. They dropped the second one, and then ultimately they did surrender, right? And that was kind of the end of that war. This war, as I said at the beginning, was so destructive in terms of deaths, especially civilian deaths, but also millions of people were left homeless and displaced. When they emptied out the camps, and they all these people had to find their way home or find where they were going. Cities in Europe had been bombed until they were in rubble, in shambles. They were, economically crippled. And they also had to deal with the fact that now we have the atomic bomb, and how is that going to play out? Anyway, so that's how that's pretty much the war, and I'm sure I've talked way long enough, so I'll stop here.